Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with David A. Shirey. David's stories, slice of life vignettes, essays, and sermons ponder day-to-day life for glimpses of God's redeeming grace. He looks out at the world from his desk of curiosities under the canopy of a majestic maple. A pastor for 40 years, he grew up a Buckeye, graduated a Hoosier, and now lives and writes in the Kentucky bluegrass with the thoroughbreds, bourbon, and big blue nation. And I'll let him tell you in a minute about where he's actually at right now. He and his wife, Jenny, have a son and two daughters, three grandchildren, a granddog, and cherished friendships from across their life together. David's first book is titled It Don't Get Any Better Than This, Stories from a Small Town Church. And I'm happy to say that our colleague Ann Thomas helped David create the book. We can talk about that more in a minute too. Anyway, you can learn more at davidashirey.com. That's Shirey. So David, so great to have you here, and congratulations on everything.
Brian, thanks. You did mention that I'm not at my desk of curiosities under the canopy of the maple tree, and I miss it. That's back in Lexington because just within the last month and a half, I was called to do an interim ministry. So I'm at Broadway Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Columbia, Missouri, in a bare office, but it's going to have to do for today.
Well, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. So other than what I mentioned, what else would you like people to know about you?
Well, Brian, since I'm talking to you and knowing your role with Frederick Buechner, I have to say that a long time ago, I was just smitten by his comment and invitation to listen to your life and see it for the fathomless mystery that it is, because in the last analysis, all life is key moments and life itself is grace. And that has, for 35 years or so, been deep within me, just to pay attention to the life that we're given and to take it in for all that it's worth. And I think over the course of time, that all crystallized for me in sort of a mission statement for me that I want to see, perceive, savor, and share. I want to see, I want to pay attention. I want to perceive, I want to understand the deeper meanings and the connectedness of it all, because deep within, I'm convinced it's all interdependence. And I want to savor that when I can sense it and give thanks for it and enjoy it. And then share what I've seen and perceived and savored in whatever way that I can, whether it's writing or preaching or just in conversation with others.
Amen. Amen.
Yep.
So let's talk about your book. As I mentioned, the title is It Don't Get Any Better Than This, Stories from a Small Town Church. So can you tell us the story behind that book?
Well, it came as a debt of gratitude, Brian, to really, literally, a couple dozen people of a church in Carthage, Tennessee, a county seat town of about 2,000 in East Central Tennessee, that called me to be their pastor when I was a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I was 22 years old. One of the upper class, in this case men, invited me to fill in for him at this little church he had been serving. And I said, yeah, I think I have one sermon that I did at some point, maybe Youth Sunday when I was 17 or something. And so I drove out an hour from Nashville, preached there with knocking knees to, 15 people or something, and came back. That was that. And later that week, had a call, and it turned out it was the head elder of that congregation. And his real name was Alexander Campbell Reed Jr. One of our founders of our Disciples of Christ was Alexander Campbell, but everybody called him Mr. Bill. And he said, David Shirey, we had a congregational meeting after worship Sunday, and we've called you to be our next pastor.
Oh my goodness.
I said, oh, Mr. Bill, I wasn't looking to be your pastor. He said, that was a statement. That wasn't a question, son.
Oh, man.
And they called me, Brian. And then for the next 3 years, again, 22 years old, for the next 3 years, I served them, had my first funeral, my first sermons, my first wedding. I met my wife during those years, and she ended up coming out with me. And ended up playing the organ and piano for them when their organist pianist of 70 some years backed her car into a live oak tree and broke her hand. They made Jenny's wedding dress for her. I was ordained on their chancel steps. And that church closed in 1997, 12 years after I left. It burned to the ground in 2004. There's just a little marker there now in that area to it. And I wanted to honor them. I wanted to make sure their story wasn't forgotten. And so I pulled together several stories and vignettes from across the years and actually sent them to Fred Craddock when Fred was still living. And he said, David, I think you ought to go to your historical society, Disciples of Christ, and see if they'd like to publish it. And well, they did, Brian, and it wasn't really done really well, really low scale, low budget, and low distribution. The original version, Brian, has sold dozens worldwide. Okay. And I just decided in my retirement that I wanted to go back to it, and I wanted to do it sort of right. And so I added 15 chapters to it. Wow. And as you mentioned, turned to Adam Thomas to format this and to help me with the cover, because you, Brian, in the business of writing conference, told us, look, it's a different world now. You can self-publish in a wonderful way. So that's the story. And so this past year, in the first year of my retirement, 10 years after the original edition, expanded it, reformatted it, new cover. That's the story.
That's very cool. Oh, I'm so happy that came to be and it worked out so well.
Yeah.
So what are some of the themes in the book?
Well, I think people would see first and foremost it's gratitude. I've just mentioned to you what those people did for me and seeing me into ministry. And just like Paul said to the Philippians, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you and every prayer of mine for you, making my prayer with joy, grateful for your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. That gratitude for them and how God worked through them to bless me is definitely a big part of it. Certainly, a theme is the odd people that God uses in brilliant ways to accomplish God's purposes in this world. And again, I think of the Corinthians, Paul says something like, consider your call. Not many of you were wise, not many of you were powerful, not many of you were of noble birth. Well, I'll tell you, those 24 people at that little church were none of those things. And yet, what I saw, again, perceive, and savored in them was God working through each of them, a passel of characters. I mean, characters, Brian, and the stories are about each of them. What somebody called God's odd. And, and I realize now, hey, David, you're one of them. And so the way that God has used those people, and I would say also that it's also a story, and one of the themes is, being called and shaped for your life's vocation. Who are the people and the experiences that call out of you who you are, what gifts and graces you have, and how they might be used to bless this world? And so, I didn't have a burning bush. I didn't have a Damascus Road experience. My life might be titled Backing into Ministry. And I think that those folks helped me to recognize that I could be of service in this world, as everyone can, of course. In my case, as a pastor of congregations, they affirmed me. They put up with me in those early years. They lovingly corrected me and suggested to me and just blessed me. So, mentoring, that's a big part of this. And I didn't realize it until I wrote the book, but the people throughout my life, from the time I was a teenager, early teen, through my college years, into seminary and beyond, who mentored me, who taught me something that I needed to hear in order to hear my call of who I am and what I needed to do. Everyone from one of my elders in the church I grew up in, to a couple of guys in the congregation of the church that I attended when I was in college, who just took me under their wings for who knows what reason, sort of a surrogate grandson, I think, to one of my classmates at Vanderbilt. I will never forget one of our assignments. Brian was reading Elie Wiesel's Night, and I took it back with me. And of course, it's a very thin volume. Of course, it's about 100 pages, maybe. And I took it back, his account of Auschwitz and Holocaust. Here's stupid David Shirey, ignorant, got home, just sort of read through it, and I thought, oh, I'm done. Good. We can go out now. And I went up and knocked on one of my friend's doors, and he said, come on in. And I walked in. He said, what's up? I said, hey, I finished Night. You want to go out? He said, what do you mean you finished Night? I said, it's easy. It's only 80 pages. He said, you did not read this. Go back downstairs, sit down, and read this. Huh. And that just, I'll never forget that. It has shaped the way I read everything with greater respect, attention, openness, care, mentoring, and a handful of Black men and women, African Americans, that throughout my life were mentors for me. I just, again, backed into this, but some of their stories, Mr. Roy and Ms. Robbie Key in Carthage, members of the Braden Chapel United Methodist Church there, and a man named Mr. Joe Robertson, who I visited as a hospice visitor during those years. And he was dying of cancer, Brian, and it was lung cancer. And the soothing thing for him was 7-Up. So I would take 7-Up to him on Saturday and preach my sermon that I was going to preach at Carthage the next day. And he would give me his amens and his encouragements and whatnot. He was my first congregation.
Wow.
Mr. Robertson.
That's very cool.
A Black man dying of cancer who just encouraged me. I can still hear his voice, honest to goodness. And on from that, their stories are in this book, but so it's a story about mentoring also, calling forth us into our life's vocation.
So you've got a couple of amazing endorsements for your book, so I would like to read a couple of them. This one's from none other than Eugene Peters, author of The Message. He says, pastors have a front row seat watching reruns of the gospel story week after week. David's stories are as good as they get. So coming from Eugene Peterson, that's really quite a compliment. Are there any particular stories that you would say is a great rerun of the gospel?
Yeah. Now, those viewing this will recognize that he died, several years ago, about 2018 or so, somewhere around back there. But let me tell you the story first of Eugene and my acquaintance with him. And that was simply by reading his books and deciding several years ago, I had this feeling I need to sit down and write letters of gratitude to what I call my paper mentors, authors who have influenced my life. And he was one of them. And so I wrote a letter. I had to call the publisher and say, how do I get a letter to Eugene Peterson? They said, send it to us. We'll forward it on to him and he'll receive it. And that was a year I was taking a sabbatical. I was starting a new church from scratch that year. And I just thought, I'm just going to ask in this letter, if I make it up to Montana, could I drop by and just say hello to you and thank you personally? And I just threw it in there. Never thought anything about it. Several months later, I got a voicemail. My phone buzzed. I was doing something else. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go to voicemail, of course. And I finally played, and it was, David, this is Eugene Peterson. I received your letter. Jan and I would welcome you to come to our home. You and Jenny spend a couple days with us. Just tell us when you're going to be here.
Wow. Oh, that's so cool.
Oh, Brian. And so we did. And we spent 2 days with them. So when I had the book ready, I sent it to him and he read through it and whatnot. But if there's one story I'd pull out that to me is a rerun of the gospel, if the gospel has to do with God's unconditional love for each and for all and God's unwavering desire to provide righteousness and justice for all and all creation, then part of that about God's unconditional love was one of my mentors, and this was a man named Mr. Joe Ross, who, when I was in high school, Brian, my self-image at that time was a fence post with acne. Okay. I was 6'3", 150 pounds. If I turned sideways, you couldn't see me. But I didn't want you to see me anyway because of my acne. And so I would, on Sunday mornings, have a choice of going to church with mom or staying at home and working around the house with dad. The lesser of two evils at that point was going to church with mom. So I'd go to church with mom and wait in the back while she cleaned up after communion or something. I just wait back there. And this man finally came over, put his arm around my shoulders, looked up to me because he was shorter than me. And, he said, "David Shirey, you're something special, and don't let anybody tell you any different." And I thought, oh, geez, that's the kind of thing that old people in church say. But every Sunday he would do that.
Wow.
And eventually, this was when I was a freshman, eventually he started to take me with him when he took communion to some of our homebound and nursing home members. And then he would say, "Now this time, David, I want you to read these scripture passages, words of institution. Jesus took the bread, blessed and broke it." And then he would say, "Next week, I want you to say the prayer and all of this." Well, and meanwhile, he's continuing to every Sunday, "You're something special, da, 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 da." And of course, over that time, I started to stand up a little straighter, stick my head out a little bit more, step into some leadership roles, because I guess I started to believe him. And what he was saying, of course, was what God said when Jesus was baptized: "You're my beloved son, with you I'm well pleased." But Mr. Ross was telling me that, and I was hearing it for the first time. And my last Sunday there, Brian, when I graduated from high school and was getting ready to move out to Illinois, where my family had been transferred, I lived with my grandparents that last year of high school. I waited back in the back, and he never came. And I just waited. No, and I looked across the sanctuary, and he was standing there with his arm around this short, squat, geeky-looking freshman. And I could read his lips. He was saying to that guy, "Frank, you're something special, and don't let it." Wow. And I thought, "You two-timer, you're a two-timer." And he caught my eye at that time, and he went. And I thought, that's true for everybody. You tell everybody that, because it's true. Goodness. And Brian, he died that fall. My grandmother sent me this obituary when I was at college that he had died. And I sat on my bed by that point, pulled out a little bit more, and I just wept out of recognition. But Brian, about 4 years ago, I was up at Chautauqua. You've been there.
Yeah,
I was at Chautauqua, and one of a pastor in our denomination, very fine pastor that's about 15 years older than me, came over to me and he said, "David, I got your book." This was the old one, so he's one of the couple dozen that bought one, I think. And he said to me, "I'm one of Mr. Ross's boys too." I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "He did the same thing to me. He did it to everybody, male and female, Brian, male and female." And I thought, wow, that the gospel begins at least with someone communicating to you that you are unconditionally loved and you're created in God's image. And then I learned Mr. Ross gave his life to anything that had to do with being a blessing to youth, boys club, YMCA. Wow. That was all of his stuff. So you're blessed, of course, to be a blessing.
My goodness. What a role model. What a good guy.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
Jeez. That's amazing. So here's another endorsement from somebody else who's passed away since, Fred Craddock. He says, "David Shirey is remembered clearly and written beautifully. All the ingredients of ministry and church are here. This is a delightful book. I'm already reading it again." So Fred Craddock obviously was a renowned preacher. Now that you've written a book, how do you compare the process to writing sermons?
Yeah, Fred, of course. And I knew Fred too, thankfully. I spent time with him and got to know him personally. Fred and Eddie, master storyteller, and just one of the premier preachers of
Yeah.
20th century, no question about it. Well, I guess in a sermon, of course, you're exegeting a text and you're drawing out its meanings to enlighten people and inspire people and challenge people and motivate people. And in your writing, at least what I try to do in this case also is to exegete a people or a circumstance or a congregation and draw out its meanings, to enlighten and inspire and challenge and motivate. And the preachers illustrate the gospel story with people's stories. And I think we also can take people's stories and invite the gospel to overlay them and inform and critique and challenge and redeem and all of our stories. But the juxtaposition of those two is one of my Eugene Peterson quotes that I just love, and that is, he wrote a book back in must have been the 90s, early 90s, Under the Unpredictable Plant. Mm-hmm. An exploration in vocational holiness, Brian. Keep that in mind, vocational holiness. But he had a part in there where he talked about James Joyce's book, Ulysses, that is Joyce's masterpiece, about yay thick, following Leopold Bloom for one day through the streets of Dublin, and in a way that combines Leopold Bloom's story with Ulysses, the great classic. It's brilliant, of course, and it's one of the masterpieces of literature. And Eugene Peterson said something, about Joyce waking him up to the infinity of meaning within the ordinariness of ordinary people in ordinary days. You hearing echoes of Buechner here?
Yes, okay. Absolutely.
And he said, it helped me to recognize that the story that's unfolding before my eyes isn't the Greek story of Ulysses, but the gospel story of Jesus Christ. And so he said, just as James Joyce was able to see Ulysses' story in Leopold Bloom's life, he wanted to be able to see the gospel story in his congregation's life. And that just impacted me tremendously. So that's, to me, the preaching, the writing, seeing the stories intersecting to enrich and interpret each other. Gospel story in our stories.
Very cool. Very cool. So as you know, I just launched a business called Find Your Next Calling, where we talk about discernment and starting new businesses. And I think that will be attractive to pastors, that are looking for something to do, after they stop pastoring, at least, full time. And you've recently made that transition to part author, single person entrepreneur, now an interim pastor. So can you talk a little bit about that transition? How do you view it?
First of all, thank you, Brian. This is a good thing you're doing. And I've already been on your site and availed myself of some of that good stuff there. And I will continue to. I will say that when I was contemplating retirement, two particular books that I came back to and blessed me, and you know them both, but Richard Rohr's Falling Upward and Parker Palmer's On the Brink of Everything. I love them both.
Yes, I quoted from both of those.
Read them and reread them and read them and reread them. And recognizing in both of them that, life has its rhythms and its crescendos and its movement. And there's a place, if we're blessed enough to live later into life, where the accrued wisdom and understanding and experiences that we have can be used in some wonderful ways. And so that stood out with me. And when I retired, it wasn't that I'm retired and putting my feet up. Fred Craddock said, David, you never retire from following Jesus. And I believe that.
Yeah.
But I needed to find then and transition, Brian, good word, into whatever it is that I'm going to do next. Now, I didn't know what it was. And I spent my first 9 months or so trying to figure that out. The first thing that was helpful for me was my spiritual director saying, David, first, why don't you just let the field lie fallow? I really liked that because it took off the pressure that I needed to find out and do something. David, let the field lie fallow. A little Sabbath time here. Just let it lie fallow for a while. And during that time, and also let me say no to a few things right away, Brian, because people came and asked me, would you do this? I said, no, letting the field lie fallow. But there came a point several months in that I started to say, okay, when do I start doing something with the field? And one of the words that popped up for me was the word steward. How can I be a good steward of the gifts and graces and experiences that I have? And what it transitioned to finally, Brian, and I'll explain this language, was how can I be a good steward of the verbs of my life? Now, several years ago, I made a list of what I call the verbs of my life. And they are what descriptors, if you will, verbs that are about what animates me and gives me purpose and meaning and joy. And I made a long list of them in my journal. I'm a journaler. And, among them were words like writing and reading and studying and connecting and befriending and worshiping and savoring and giving and thanking and encouraging. I made this whole thing. And I came to recognize as I reflected on this, because retirement gives you some opportunity for reflection, that during my years of ministry, I had ready-made outlets for all of those verbs, i.e. writing. Every week, I had 3 things that I would write every single week: a midweek sort of blog, a Sunday sermon, and letters to people that raised questions with me of theological or biblical or human import that I thought, this deserves a letter. We don't get letters anymore. Not an email, a real letter. So anyway, but every week, Brian, I had an outlet for those 3. And all of a sudden, I'm retired. I don't have those questions coming to me. I don't have a midweek blog due on Wednesday by 8:00 in the morning. I don't have a sermon to preach on Sunday. And I started to think, oh my gosh, do I just not write anymore? No. Writing is so deep within me, just like all those other verbs. And one of the things Parker Palmer says is your vocation is, persisting in what you can't not do.
Right.
That's that points to your vocation. Well, I can't not write, Brian. I can't not write. And so I started to say, okay, how am I going to write now that I'm not in ministry? The answer is not, well, David, write more sermons, write more whatever. And so I realized that reading and studying and learning and all that, and I happened to pawn your seminar of the business of spiritual writing, and I thought, well, this is perfect. So I got on it, and one of the things that came out of it, Brian, was encouraging us to think about our websites. And you said, if you're not online, you don't exist. And you also said, you may not like the word marketing, you ministers. That's just business stuff. You're not
right.
But you said, if you've got a gift that's worth sharing for the betterment of this world, then find a way to use it and make it known. That would be good stewardship.
Yes.
So I came out of that session with you, Brian, saying, okay, I need to find a way that I can write in a way that is good stewardship of who I am at my age, in a way that reaches out in some way and is a blessing to others. And he said this stuff about a website, and I'm the least technologically savvy person in this world. Maybe I'll just hire somebody to do it. But I recognize, wait a minute, no. Some of your verbs, David, are researching and learning and studying. There's a million ways online you can learn how to make your own website.
Yep. That's right.
So I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a website because I love to research and learn and understand things and study. It's going to be a hub somehow for my writing. And you shared some other thing. I forget exactly what it was, Brian, but someone that said, make it a luscious garden.
Oh, yes.
Your community wants
build a community. Yeah. Right? Don't think of it as a platform. Think of it as a community that you invite,
A luscious garden you can invite your community into. I love that. And I thought, I do want to invite my community, because one of my gifts is pastoring. Well, the answer is not to be a pastor again of a church. I happen to be right now, but I wanted to find a place where through my writing and whatnot, I could remain in touch with, connect with people that I've known throughout my life and maybe new people. And so all I'm saying is I started to imagine ways in which the verbs of my life
Hmm.
that had reference when I was a pastor of a congregation could have a new referent. And boy, that became really fun.
So,
Transitioning into retirement,
yeah.
lining up those verbs in new ways. It's been wonderful.
So I think that sounds like another book you should write about the verbs.
Hey, I wrote an article about this, Brian, because so many folks near my age, some of whom are retired, others are thinking about it, and they would ask me, "How is it? What are you doing?" And I started to tell them some of these things. They said, you need to write this down. I said, oh yeah, okay. I'd love to. I'll do it. So I did write an article, and somewhere it'll show up somewhere. Probably
Oh
on my
well,
website
if
first.
you can find it, send me a link to it, and I'll
Well, no, no,
post
no.
it
I,
too.
I I can find it, but I'll let you know. But that was important to me because one of the reasons I write, that all of us write, is to make meaning for ourselves. I want to understand something, and there's no better way for me to understand it than if I can write about it.
Hmm.
If I can understand it, then maybe someone else
It
might.
forces you, right, to
Yes,
be
it
able to
does.
articulate it. You know.
To articulate, yeah.
Yeah. So, what advice do you have for other pastors looking for their new calling?
Ooh,
Look for
um,
their verbs. Look for.
no, I honestly would say that for me, that's my thing. Understand what your verbs are, um, and then understand that to be a good steward of our lives, ministry as pastors continues beyond congregations to this world of God's creating. And how can you find a reference for your verbs that will bless and this church, this world, and create righteous, justice for its people. This is kin to Buechner's thing about, the place where God calls you is the
Yeah,
place where
yeah.
there's deep gladness and the world's deep hunger. My
No.
deep gladness is my verbs. And the world's deep hunger is the places I need to aim those verbs now. That's just all there is. And, and I will say another thing you said, Brian, that was helpful to me. And that is you said to us, whatever you do, creating a website or writing whatever, be you. Be you. Don't try to be, somebody else. And that just resonated. One of my favorite stories is this old rabbinic tale about the guy named Zusha. And he came to the point that he realized that he said, when I'm standing before my maker's not going to say, why weren't you like Moses? My maker's going to say, why weren't you like Zusha? And so just my pastor colleagues, to know what made them tick, what makes their hearts sing. Hey, there were things I did as a pastoral congregational minister that I didn't want to do again after my retirement. They were part of what I had to do. They
Sure,
didn't make my heart sing, but there were things that I did in ministry that I loved. But now I need to do them in different ways. And, I have found in this whole process in the writing community anyway, Brian, which is sort of new for me, is just the graciousness of writers,
mm-hmm.
the sharing, the openness. Now, of course, my circle of ministers, we're different. We ministers can be, we can be territorial, threatened, and peacock about how many are you worshiping? Well, frankly, I'm worshiping one, just God. Okay, but no, all this kind of stuff. But honestly, I've been so gratefully surprised by the graciousness of writers and the writing community. Writing for Your Life is a great case in point. You have provided a place, Kate, now picking up, providing a place where writers can go to find resources and to provide resources and to be helpful to one another.
I mean, the community that ended up being
Oh,
assembled around that, is exactly what you said. Just a group of people that are really caring and,
oh,
helpful and serving and sharing. And it's just wonderful.
I couldn't be, amen. Yes. Yes. And of course, tell that, as far as this transition, pay attention, pray deeply, and have a spiritual director, someone that knows you well enough to listen to you and can discern real deep what may be happening in there.
Well, you know the thing about verbs, I'm going to use that now, in some of my classes to tell people is that look for your verbs.
I think everybody can do that, Brian. You can name them. People can name them.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep,
That's
yep.
really good. That's really good.
Oh,
So,
just one more thing on
yeah,
that, Brian.
sure.
The verbs, about my thing about not having a referent for them after I retired. And I found a quote from a novelist named Jamie Anderson, and she was writing about grief. And she said, grief is just love with nowhere to go.
Mm, mm,
Oh my
mm,
gosh.
mm,
Love with nowhere to go. My verbs had nowhere to go for
hmm.
the first months of my retirement, and I was aching for them to come out.
Wow.
I just got to give a nod to her. I think that's one of the most tremendous quotes. It's
I'd never
longer
heard
than
that
that, but
before.
that's the part I remember. It's just love. It's love with no place to go. I want to give it, but the reference not there anymore.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just had to
Oh,
come back to that.
goodness sakes. Well, I know you've got your, interim gig going on now, but are there any other projects that you kind of have on the horizon or whatever that you can at least talk about, or is it too
All
early?
right, Brian. This interim gig, which I vowed I was not going to take an interim. We have regional ministers that are like our bishops or judicatory heads, and I said to Dawn, no, I'm not interested in interim and whatnot. And then I got a call from a couple friends about this particular situation. And I said, all right, I'll pray about this. And I said yes because as I learned more about it, it did seem to match up with just me being me.
Hmm,
I
hmm.
was not going to have to do things that didn't match up with who I was. And I've arrived at this place with Zusha and whatnot that if I can be David Shirey the way I understand myself, I will offer David Shirey. And so I'll do it. But beyond that, um, again, Brian, I have just this debt of gratitude. Ministry was a wonderful thing for me. I want to write a book about every church that I served.
Hmm,
And so I'm
hmm.
beginning my second book. My
Wow.
first full-time church after Carthage was in St. Louis.
Okay.
So here I am in Missouri.
You're
And
back in Missouri.
I'm going to write my book about Compton Heights Christian Church this year when I'm in Columbia. It's going to be called Pew and Pavement because it was a inner city church that
Hmm,
made this wonderful connection between the pews and the pavement of those streets.
hmm.
That was actually the title of a newsletter that our urban ministry did back then, long gone. And I will definitely attribute that, but I love the
Sure, sure.
of course, putting my website together and now cultivating and keeping that thing going as a project that
Uh-huh.
I've enjoyed. It's just fresh and new, so I'm just figuring it out. Writing articles and sending them here and there. That's like fishing to me, Brian. A lot of people do fishing in retirement, but I'll write an article. I'll throw it out to a place.
Yeah, yeah.
Got a great collection of rejection letters and emails. Not love them. Have got them for a long time, but
Just like every other writer.
sometimes you get a bite, and when you see that barber store, oh, that's cool. So I've been doing that with articles, and I guess ultimately and finally, you can hear I have to tell a story with everything. But when I was starting my new church in Arizona, we met in an elementary school cafeteria for 8 years as we got up enough gumption to be able to do anything else. And there was a member of my church back then named Eve Calbert, and another one of my African American mentors and brothers. And we would pray before the service started, and we'd walk out from this little classroom into the cafeteria, and Eve would always sort of elbow me, and he would say, "What's the Lord going to do today, Pastor?" And I'd say, "Eve, I don't know. Let's go see." Bless his heart. Every morning I wake up, Ryan, I can hear him.
That's
"What's the
great.
Lord going to do today, David?" "I don't know, Eve, but let's go see."
Oh,
That's
that's
the way I
great.
want to spend the rest of my life, Brian.
Oh my gosh. Listening to your life.
Yeah.
To your life.
Thank you, Frederick Buechner, Brian
Yeah.
Elaine.
Yeah. Wow.
Yep.
Well, David, it's been so, wonderful to hear your stories and hear what you're doing and hear how well this transition is going. I mean, it's clear in your voice and then your passion and your enthusiasm and your vibe, you know. So I'm really so glad about that. But
Well, Brian, I hope you hear my gratitude for the role you've had in
oh
this.
well,
Honestly,
thank you,
honestly.
but that's you
Okay.
know, that's why I'm here. So
Amen. Amen.
so everyone should go on Amazon, right? I can assume they can get your book there
Yeah, it's on Amazon and it's on my I got a place on my website, of
on your
course.
website, David A.
The reason it's davidashirey.com is there's a David Shirey that's sort of a motivational speaker and he had David Shirey. So I'm just David A. Shirey now.
DavidAShirey.com. So go check
And,
it out there
yeah.
and keep in touch with us and let us know, you know, when the next book comes out and what else you're up to.
And I'll be in touch with you because it's good stuff, Brian. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
All right. Well, so long for now.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.